about to see a potential disaster unfold.
A car deliberately driving into the ocean.
It's almost too unbearable to watch.
This situation is supremely horrifying.
It happens on March 4th, 2014, just before 5 p.m. in Daytona Beach, Florida, known as the world's most famous beach.
This particular area of Florida, cars are allowed to drive on the beach. And while everyone's out enjoying their day, they see a woman driving curiously close to the water.
You're thinking, why is this car going into the ocean?
It's a stormy day. Winds are driving big waves onto the shore. But this black minivan edges dangerously close to the water. Concerned, people driving by begin to videotape. And then they hear something terrifying.
Are they saying help? If they're saying help, that's different.
Young children are in the car, and they're scared for their lives.
You see these two children leaning out the window, help us, help us.
People race over. Disaster is imminent.
There's the vehicle, children screaming, the crashing waves, a potentially lethal situation.
Timmy Tessinier, a former volunteer firefighter, is driving home with his family when he sees the unfolding horror.
The one kid was hanging out the back window saying, "She's trying to kill us, she's trying to kill us." When I heard the word help, I took off running.
At the same time, Stacy Robinson is packing up after a day at the beach when he hears something that is almost too awful to comprehend.
Help us, help us, help us. My mom is trying to kill us. It's like a scene out of a horror movie. It was horrible.
Both men race towards the car. When they get there, they see two panicked children and a catatonic woman behind the wheel.
She seemed possessed. No emotion. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying. It was mind-blowing.
The look on her face was just blank, like she was just not there, just a spaced-out look.
The car edges deeper into the ocean, and the early March conditions are especially precarious.
It was very windy. The water was freezing, bone-chilling water.
And even more frightening, one of the children, a 10-year-old boy, has climbed onto his mother's lap and is wrestling with her.
The son was fighting with her, snatching the wheel, trying to get her to come out of the water.
And that's when the woman does something unthinkable.
I heard the engine rev. She headed towards the deep end, gunned it towards the deep end.
Turned the van like hard left, straight into the water.
As Tim frantically waves to the rescue vehicles that have pulled onto the beach, Stacy jumps into action.
I chased the van down.
But the car is now getting pulled under the wild waves.
That water was picking that van up off the ground and moving it around.
You're in a critical situation of how much time you have to try to get those people out of the car.
Determined to save the children, Stacy manages to slip his arm into a window that is slightly open, just as the car sinks further underwater.
The height, I'm 6'6", and it was mid-chest.
You saw it getting closer and deeper into the waves, and the waves getting higher.
I was pushing buttons, and my next step was to break the window. Like a split second later, the back window was coming down.
Stacy quickly reaches in and pulls the boy and his 9-year-old sister to safety. But this disaster is far from over. As he wraps his arms around the panicked siblings, they scream at him.
My baby sister, her baby is still in the car.
There was a baby still in the child seat, and we never see the baby. It was just awful.
With one of the kids literally leaning out of the window yelling, "Help us," bystanders leap into action.
It's a horrific scene. A mother drives a car into the ocean with her screaming kids inside. Good Samaritans manage to pull two children to safety. But then, a devastating realization. There's still another child trapped inside.
As fast as it happened, we never saw this baby we never seen the car seat. And I thought, oh, no.
Oh, God Almighty, there's a baby in the car.
As Tim tries to open the back of the minivan, a lifeguard rushes in. But the surf is swirling dangerously.
I slipped and fell, and I thought, man, if I get trapped under this van, I'm in trouble.
It's intense. Another lifeguard runs in, and with the car about to go under, he frees the 3-year-old girl from the car seat just in time.
He almost went under, too.
A huge wave came over top of the van, like a few seconds later.
And as if all this isn't shocking enough, in the midst of the danger and chaos, the dazed mother climbs out of the car and casually strolls away.
Just nonchalantly walking down the beach, away from the van.
And there's something else.
That's when I noticed her stomach. Like, wow, she's pregnant. She has a pretty nice baby bump.
It blows my mind that those kids had a chance of dying that day. There's a baby.
The woman, 36-year-old Ebony Wilkerson, and her children are taken to a hospital for evaluation as police launch an investigation. Just a few hours later, custody of the kids is handed over to Florida's Department of Children and Families.
She definitely tried to kill her children.
The children's words haunt investigators. They tell them Mom was going to drive us into the ocean to die.
Mama was trying to kill us. Mama was crazy.
The more we learn about the story, the more troubling it becomes.
Video of the horrifying scene instantly goes viral.
She deliberately drove her minivan right into the ocean.
Her other kids are the ones who's saying, no, 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 there's a baby still in there.
On Friday, March 7th, 2014, Ebony is arrested and charged with 3 counts of attempted murder and child abuse. But her family says she needs medical help. Earlier, on the day of the ocean incident, her sister calls 911.
She's talking about Jesus and that there's demons in my house.
It turns out that Ebony has recently come to Florida from South Carolina, running from a husband she says is abusive. Her sister is alarmed by her mental state.
The day before, her family had actually taken her for some mental evaluation. She was showing signs of mental crisis.
But the next morning, Tuesday, March 4th, Ebony's sister learns that she's checked out early, and the family is desperately worried about her and her children.
She's getting a little bit better, but she's still not all here. So she's trying to drive, and I'm trying to stop her.
Under Florida's Baker Act, families can get emergency detention for people impaired by mental illness. But authorities tell her sister that in this situation, there's nothing they can do.
At that time, you didn't have anything to indicate that she was a danger to the children or to herself.
Just a few hours after leaving the mental health facility, Ebony is driving her kids into the ocean. And if not for those heroic Good Samaritans, it very likely would have ended in tragedy.
They put themselves in harm's way to save these children.
After a mental evaluation, the attempted murder charges against Ebony are dropped, and she pleads not guilty by reason of insanity to 3 counts of felony child abuse.
Wilkerson will be committed for up to 6 months.
At a hearing in December 2014, 9 months after Ebony tries to drown her own children, she's overcome with emotion.
You know, I understand that something could have happened to me and my children when I was in this psychosis.
In September 2019, after being in supervised care for 5 years, Ebony is released, but is only allowed to see her children on supervised visits. The men who saved her children say they will never forget that day.
God put us there. Higher powers had their hand in that.
And now, they just wish Ebony and her family the best.
I would love to meet those children. I probably wouldn't say too much. Just a hug, you know? Just a hug. That's it.
Coming up, 2 children sleep on a couch, totally unaware that someone is watching them.
Literally intruders coming in while your babies are sleeping. This is every parent and grandparent's worst nightmare.
Sometimes it's the things we don't see that are the scariest of all.
A burglar creeping through a Florida home.
Rockledge, Florida, October 22nd, 2016, 1:30 a.m. All is quiet in the houses that line the streets in this pleasant suburban town less than 60 miles east of Orlando.
A 10 and a 13-year-old are fast asleep on the couch in their grandparents' home. They probably fell asleep while watching TV or playing video games.
The girls are the granddaughters of homeowner Al Vera and his wife, Christine. Al and Christine are also asleep in the nearby bedroom on the same floor. All of them are blissfully unaware that outside, danger is waiting, until the door is slowly pushed open and an intruder enters.
You can see him carefully tiptoeing in. He's looking around. He's creeping around this room, just inches away from these sleeping grandchildren.
Who is this man, and what is he looking for?
This video made the last hair on my head stand straight up. Someone is entering your house where you feel safe, and they're doing it amongst your grandchildren. You have someone inches away from them and putting them in peril as they're trying to steal your things. That, to me, is terrifying.
This is every parent and grandparent's worst nightmare. Literally intruders coming in while your babies are sleeping.
With a flashlight drawn, the intruder creeps through the first floor of the home in darkness. He makes his way from the living room to the kitchen, and soon it becomes clear what his intentions are.
He's picking up some items that he's kind of questioning whether or not he wants them or not.
At one point, he appears frustrated, but he continues to search deeper inside the home.
Burglars want small stuff that they could stuff into their pockets, or into a pillowcase, and they can just take off with it.
All the while, just feet away, the 2 girls don't even stir as they sleep. The burglar spies something of value, then one of the girls' cell phones. But then another shock. Behind him, the door slowly opens.
We see a gun attached to a hand of another individual.
The intruder doesn't react, which suggests the gun is being held by his partner in crime, standing guard just outside the door.
This is a really precarious situation.
They came prepared. They had one person looking out and another person intrude. And the fact that they have a gun shows that they have a plan B in case things don't turn out the way they want them to. If someone starts to scream, they'll use that gun to silence them.
In Rockledge, Florida, 2 children sleep soundly, unaware of the danger beside them.
Brazen and unafraid, an alleged burglar walks through the kitchen area of a home where people are sleeping.
Not only could they wake up at any moment, so could their grandparents, sleeping just a few feet away.
If the intruders are interrupted by someone in the house, it introduces a whole host of unknowns and a large volume of danger.
Al Vera and his wife Christine have lived in their tight-knit Florida neighborhood since 1991. They have plenty of family nearby, including their beloved grandchildren.
Usually every other week or so, I'll get my grandkids and let them spend the night. It was a regular night. We just had dinner, we watched some TV, and then let the kids sleep in the living room. My niece also lived with me at that time, and she was out. So when she's out, we usually leave the door open for her when she gets home so she can get in, because she doesn't have a key. And we've never had a problem in this neighborhood of even locking our doors. We never really think twice about it.
The intruders leave with a few stolen items, and the family sleeps through the invasion, unaware of the terror that has unfolded right in their own home during the night. Early the next morning, Al and Christine head out to their car to leave for work.
When I got into the vehicle, the first thing I noticed was the glove box was open. I don't usually leave the glove box open.
I said, were you in the car? And he said, no. And he goes, don't touch nothing. And he goes, oh my God, we were robbed.
And everything was rifled through, and you could see everything all over the car. I must have left the car open, not even thinking about it.
Among the items missing are his wallet, his credit cards, a flashlight, and ominously, his .38 revolver.
So during a burglary, one of the things that homeowners hate the most is that their personal items are stolen, such as cash or jewelry. But a firearm, when that goes missing, that takes that burglary to a whole other level.
Al calls the police and then checks his outdoor security cameras.
I wanted to see if I could see who it was that went to the car, but the video was very grainy. You couldn't hardly see anything, but you could see like the lights coming on in the car, and you could see figures, but you couldn't see anything more than that.
Within 15 minutes, officers arrived to file a report and fingerprint the car.
And then when they left, I took my wife to work. When I got back home, grandkids were up, and my oldest grandkid that was over there, she was complaining, where's my cell phone? My cell phone's missing. And I said, well, it's got to be wherever you laid it. I'll go to the cameras, see where you last laid it down, and see if we can find it, what happened to it.
And when Al checks the footage from the security cameras inside his house, his blood suddenly runs cold.
My jaw just dropped. Well, that's our front door. Watched him walking around in my house. My grandkids right there on the couch as he walks by. I was in shock. I couldn't believe it.
It made me angry. It made me violated that some idiot can just walk. It doesn't matter if my door's locked or not. How dare you come into my home uninvited?
But I knew then, I put two and two together after, and I knew it was the same perps that came in the house that went through my car. And I found out what happened to the phone because she actually picks it up and takes the phone.
And although they made off with Al's own gun, they entered the house packing firepower of their own.
Wasn't my weapon. They already had a weapon with them. I had a .38 revolver, and that was a semi-automatic that they stuck through the door.
We got off easy. They didn't steal a lot from us. They didn't hurt us. But for them to be pointing a gun at the grandkid's head through the door, that gun could have went off. I don't even want to think about that.
The police are called again, and they return to Al and Christine's house. And the gravity of how close the family slept to danger starts to really sink in.
One officer said to me, it could have been devastating. It could have been really bad. That's what got me thinking, too, about that. Wow, if I would have just woke up, I don't know what or if I could have done anything. And that's what spooks you, that you wouldn't be able to even protect your own grandchildren. The police had told me that there were groups that were coming from out of town. They would be dropped off in a vehicle, 4 or 5 people, and they'd go through the neighborhood.
The video of the burglars creeping around his home just inches from his granddaughter's becomes a news sensation.
Crime of opportunity, a burglar caught on camera.
Watch as the burglar pushes his way inside the home through the front door.
Detectives are still looking for the men they say burglarized the home.
It went national and was on every television station, and you could see this guy's face. You'd think somebody would have picked him out and found him. But to this day, nope, nothing.
We were looking at the videos saying, why can't they find him? And because if you look at the videos with his gloves on, they have the net mesh over the fingers that you can't see. That's why there were no fingerprints, because he touched just about everything in the house.
The burglars have never been caught, but the break-in has had a lasting effect on the Vera family.
Burglary is a very invasive type of crime. People feel violated when someone has been in their house who shouldn't be there and has taken their stuff. So psychologically, this really rattles people.
After that happened, I really got a sense of having to secure the home and protect my wife, myself, a lot better than I did that evening.
We have more cameras in our home. We have them all outside. We have deadbolts on our front door. We live in Fort Knox now. You can't come in.
It's June 6th, 2016, when this quiet home in Austin, Texas becomes the latest addition to the more than 1 million homes burglarized every year in the United States.
He was captured on camera walking from room to room, speeding up as the alarm system kicked on.
We see the burglar going about his business pretty much unfazed by the fact that their alarm is going off, and didn't seem to be particularly bothered, certainly by household pets. He is on a mission to get whatever stuff he can and get the heck out of there.
If you didn't know the context of the video, you would think this is this guy's house. He's looking for something, he lost his keys. He just seems so at ease and so comfortable.
With the children in daycare and their parents at work, no one is home but the family dog to watch as the audacious intruder rifles through drawers and countertops before finally making his getaway with pockets full of stolen goods.
He's not fussing around. He's looking for small, valuable objects. He's not going to get caught with a TV in his hand. He's very strategic with how he's stealing.
The invasion of a family's most personal space is traumatizing.
Home is where you're safe. It's where your children go to bed. So the thought of this stranger rummaging through your bedroom is extremely alarming.
People feel a sense of that they've been violated with a crime like this. As a matter of fact, there are some people who wind up moving from their homes because they just can't get over the fact that someone's been in their house.
And for homeowners Megan and Nathan Zellner, the break-in is especially painful.
Our son was born in that house, and so it's a very special place.
You feel that violation, but you also feel that lack of control. Like your house should be the one place that you have the most control over.
It's an experience made all the more traumatic as the Zellners watch it unfold in real time on their security camera's cell phone app.
Megan calls me up and she said that the alarm company called and the back door had tripped off. And I pulled up my phone and it had the camera web app on it, and here the alarm going off, and sure enough, there's a guy walking around in our kitchen. And it was like, you have that sense of dread of like, oh no, somebody's in my house. Could see him go over and try to fiddle with the code as if he could somehow turn it off. And then he disappears for about a minute, almost 2 minutes down the hallway, and reappears. I was really worried that my computer would be stolen.
As their alarm company alerts the police, the Zellners race home. Nathan is more than 20 minutes away, but Megan is right around the corner.
As soon as I saw the alarm company calling, I'm already grabbing my purse and my keys to leave. And so within probably 3 or 4 minutes, I pulled up. I didn't want to park right outside in case there was someone there. So I parked down the street and waited. And, you know, my adrenaline was just pumping. Like, you want to go in, you want to see, and there's part of you that is itching for a confrontation at that point. I thought for sure I would see a car or somebody leaving the house. And I sat there for what felt like an eternity.
From her spot down the street, there's no way for Megan to know if the burglar is still inside or how dangerous he might be.
Who knows what he has on him? Who knows if he has like a weapon? And what if someone walked in on him? He could have, retaliated.
The minutes tick away as Megan waits for the police. And once they arrive, what the Zellners learn about this burglar will send a ripple of terror through their entire community. As a midday burglary is underway at her North Austin home, Megan Zellner waits anxiously for the police just down the street from her front door.
You don't want to go into your house as much as your instincts may be telling you to do that, but for someone knowing that someone's in your house who doesn't belong there, it's going to feel like forever.
Minutes later, the police and Megan's husband, Nathan, both arrive at the scene. The officers conduct a sweep of the property, but the thief has already taken off.
He had long gone by that point, so we were able to assess.
When the police and Megan and I went into the backyard, the back door, like the frame was all shattered, the wood was all broke. There's just something about seeing your house in that condition that was just like, oh, this is pretty sad.
He went to where he thought he could get the most bang for his buck. And so he went through our top dresser drawers. And I had a jewelry roll in one of those top drawers, mostly costume jewelry from each of my grandmothers. And then he did grab my watch, but I think that's it. He was in and out very quickly.
But the Zellners aren't going to take this theft lying down.
We had the video and we sent that to the detective. And what we did that evening was post the video online. And there was instant feedback. People started connecting some dots.
As the Zellners' video spreads on social media and through the local news, more photos and more stories come to light, connecting this shameless thief to at least 2 other home invasions over the last month.
Different homeowner just a few miles away says the same man also burglarized his home.
He broke into a house down near San Antonio and was kind of working his way up I-35. Then somebody had posted that earlier in the same day, they confronted an individual coming out from the backyard of their house.
And I said, you know, what are you doing at my house? And he goes, somebody was crying in your yard and the dog was barking. And of course I called BS on that and he got really mad.
It was a real confrontation that started getting a shouting match, and the guy who came out of the backyard got in his truck and tried to run him over or backed out of the driveway really fast.
At this point, the upset burglar jumped into his white SUV, rammed it into Bugmaster's truck, and peeled out of his front lawn, nearly hitting the homeowner.
It felt like, wow, we kind of got it off easy.
And the more the Zellners learn, the more they discover just how lucky they really were.
Come to find out that this burglar, only a couple of hours earlier, had stolen a firearm.
Knowing, especially after the fact that he had stolen a gun earlier in the day, and you see where things could have gone much worse. And we were very lucky that he was already gone by the time Megan got home.
But this criminal's compulsive behavior is about to become his undoing.
They caught him the next day. I think they found him sleeping in his car.
Yeah, with a bunch of stolen driver's licenses.
Yeah, something weird like that. When they caught him, it was then very easy to connect the dots to the 2 other crimes in the neighborhood.
The burglar is quickly identified as 32-year-old Randall Lee Laster, a known felon with burglary and robbery charges stretching back to 2002.
People started learning a little bit more about him, and we kind of were like, took him back. He kept making bad decisions after bad decisions, and we were just a blip on his bad decision train.
Laster is charged with unlawful possession of a firearm and 2 counts of burglary of a habitation. He is convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Being able to share their video and their experience online has done more for the Zellners than just help catch the culprit.
The neighborhood kind of grouped together and put together the evidence that eventually tied him to the crimes and led to his conviction. But for us, it was more of like taking control over a situation that felt pretty violating, getting that community involvement and reassurance. I think it helped us sleep at night instead of being scared of where we live.
And coming up next, a terrifying act of arson.
Those were big flames. She could have hurt herself. She didn't seem to care about that.
June 10th, 2019, Del City, Oklahoma. In broad daylight, in a residential suburb, a woman is caught on camera committing an outrageous crime.
How crazy is this video? This lady looks like she's someone's little nice mother or grandmother. And she walks up, and she just starts firing repeatedly into this house. And I'm like, what in the world is going on?
She fires a round of shots into the house in a very calm, cool way. And it doesn't seem like she cares if she's seen.
What really struck me was her demeanor. How she kind of just sashays up, looks a little bit over here, a little bit over there, and all of a sudden, she starts shooting. Is someone in there? And is somebody gonna return fire? Really, what's gonna happen? I had no idea.
Who is this woman? And who or what is she shooting at?
It gets worse. She walks off and comes back with a flaming towel. She takes this big flaming towel and throws it into the same entrance where she was shooting.
Those are big flames. She could have hurt herself. She didn't seem to care about that. This was a woman on a mission. She is dead set on getting rid of whoever's in that house or burning that house down, period.
There's so much that we don't know. What could happen to a person that would make them want to do such a thing?
The home quickly bursts into flames. And as the Del City Fire Department races to the scene, the property owner, Chris Bottoms, who's nearly 20 miles away at the time, learns about the blaze from a heartbreaking phone call.
And I got the call a little bit before 3, and my ex-wife, Christine, called, and she said the house is on fire. I became pretty emotional.
For the 57-year-old Army veteran, the fire is a devastating blow.
You know, that's the home that I took care of both my parents, my mother and father in. And it was also where we took care of my sister till the day she died. They all passed in that home. My brother, he was pretty quick about coming straight to me. We went directly to my property. As we were pulling up, it was still smoldering. The firemen had just put the fire out, and they were just starting to put out the crime tape. There's not one part of the home that was not touched. There was nothing that I felt could be recovered. It was a total loss from the beginning.
And as he looks at the smoldering wreckage, Chris is also confronted with a disturbing realization.
My brother felt that the insurance company was going to have questions about how the fire started. And he said, your main reason for being here is you're going to have an alibi.
The brother said, if it looks like it was arson, Chris, you're going to be a suspect. So he had a lot of trouble. It was traumatizing. This man was cut to his core.
The thought that he might be considered the prime suspect in the destruction of his family's home is overwhelming, especially when a local news crew arrives to cover the story.
Del City Fire responded to a fully engulfed house on Becker Place.
The reporter interviews neighbor Annie Durham.
All I know, I was in the house and I saw smoke.
But there's a huge catch. This neighbor is the same woman caught on the shocking video.
She calmly shoots into the house and throws a big flame into the house and then puts on a performance. And she does not seem remorseful. In fact, she seems proud. With her body language, she has her chest puffed out and her head held high. So Annie seems pretty confident that they're gonna buy her story.
This woman is just standing there giving her eyewitness account, saying that she doesn't know what happened. And you never in your mind think that the innocent witness speaking is actually the villain.
In Del City, Oklahoma, a fire at his family home leaves Chris Bottoms grieving.
I lost souvenirs, family pictures, everything. I don't have childhood pictures anymore. And my 33 years of marriage and travel with my own family, just gone.
And worse, he fears police will think he's a suspect himself, burning his unoccupied and neglected home for an insurance payout.
I was in financial difficulty. I was not making payments on the home, and basically the home was in disrepair at that time.
Sometimes it's hard for people to let go of property, even though they know that it's dilapidated, because they have an emotional bond to it. And then he has this added stress and pressure thinking, what if they think it's me? I mean, that's gotta cause him emotional turmoil.
But then, a stunning discovery changes everything. The real arsonist, Chris's neighbor, Annie Durham, is caught on her own surveillance camera.
It was actually my ex-wife that pointed out to the fire marshal, you know, Mr. Durham's got a security system, maybe it caught how the fire started. And she initially refused to give the footage, but she knew that they were just waiting on a warrant.
She tried to say no, but eventually they convinced her to let them see this footage.
My understanding is she thought she had deleted it, but it was just password protected and they had to crack the password. So computer forensic specialists were able to recover the footprint and give us the video that we have showing that what she did.
And as the video comes to light, so does the long history of strife between these two neighbors.
The feud between myself and Ann Durham went on for about 5 years, and it wasn't really bad when my family was there. She complained about trees in the yard, and anybody that blocked her view of what her cameras were able to record, she complained.
But as the years pass by, tensions begin to boil over.
After my divorce, that's when things started to get bad. So I decided to rent rooms to individuals, and unfortunately, instead of paying in money, they'd come with their drugs.
At the time, the Army veteran admits that he too got lost in the downward spiral of drug addiction, allowing his home to become a den for other drug users.
It was never a drug house with my family there. And unfortunately, when I moved these individuals into my home, it evolved into that.
Chris's life and his home begin to fall into ruin. And Annie Durham isn't happy about the dangerous new element next door.
The fire chief I talked to said he thought it might be he said this is an abandoned house, so it might be some vagrants or something.
Well, actually, there's been drug addicts living there, running in and out.
As she was getting more protective of her property. So in a 5-month period, I would say that Mrs. Durham called the police 25 times on my home. And I called twice on her. And then the home was condemned in 2017. Therefore, I was not allowed to be there. They never allowed me to go back in my home.
When the home is condemned, Chris is forced to move out and clean up his act.
I spent 28 days at the Serenity House, which is basically where veterans go to receive help. I'm free of drugs now, and I don't want to go back to doing drugs.
But there are still big problems at the now abandoned house he left behind.
Even after the water's cut off, the electricity's cut off, people were still breaking into the home. I even turned in a couple of people when I caught them in the home, and the police arrested them and gave them trespassing tickets.
The constant trespassing is what pushes Annie Durham to her breaking point, and she decides to take matters into her own hands.
I believe that somebody was in the home, began antagonizing her and getting her riled up enough to do what she did.
This was likely a form of social vigilantism. Social vigilantes truly believe that they're acting on behalf of society. And it's quite possible that she felt that, you know what, I have to get rid of this house because there are probably people who are squatting there, people who are using drugs there, it's dangerous for the neighborhood. I'm actually doing a good thing here.
I do feel some empathy for her. It's very difficult to live with bad neighbors, and Chris was worse than a bad neighbor. But while we can understand that must have been living hell for Annie, what she chose to do with it, that is the #1 issue. There's a lot of things you can do before you get to the point where you're shooting into a home and throwing firebombs into the home.
1 week after setting the fire, Annie Durham is arrested and charged with second-degree arson and discharging a firearm into a dwelling. She is currently out on bail and awaiting trial. Months later, the remains of Chris's home are leveled. But despite his crushing loss, Chris believes it's time to bring this feud to a peaceful end.
I have a lot of regrets. And when I was given a phone call by the district attorney's office concerning Ann's charges and what I expected to happen, I said, I understand what she did, and I don't want this woman to go to prison for it. I feel like there's a lot of blame to go around. If I don't forgive her, then I'm going to be bitter, angry, unhappy, and I don't want to live that way.
The night Ohio went quiet was the night everything fractured, the night the town learned how thin the wall was between ordinary and vanished, the night a single scream, or maybe the absence of one, split a life cleanly in two. It was late autumn, 1987, when the air carried that metallic cold that settles into bone, when porch lights burned longer than usual and radios murmured low, and somewhere between the last open diner and a darkened stretch of county road, a woman failed to arrive where she was expected. No witnesses came forward. No alarms sounded. No blood marked the ground. There was only a car left in the wrong place at the wrong hour, engine cold, door ajar, the radio still tuned to a local station, a song fading into static like a breath held too long. That was the first headline, unprinted but already alive, an Ohio cold case being born in real time, unnoticed until it was too late. By morning the town was awake and afraid. The victim's name traveled faster than the facts, passed between neighbors at mailboxes, whispered across counters where coffee steamed and went untouched. She had routines, people said. She took the same roads, parked in the same spots, waved to the same faces. She had a life small enough to be known, large enough to be missed. The community gathered where the car had been found, boots crunching on gravel, eyes scanning ditches and tree lines as if the truth might be crouched there, waiting to spring. Police tape fluttered, bright against gray, and the first officers on scene did what they could with what they had, photographs taken too quickly, notes scribbled in the cold, a sense of pressure already building. Every minute mattered. Every minute slipped away. Investigators traced the timeline back through the evening like surgeons probing a wound. Last confirmed sighting. Last phone call. Last purchase. Receipts were collected, timestamps circled, statements repeated until they lost meaning. The car told a story that refused to speak plainly. No sign of a struggle. No obvious theft. The keys were gone. The purse was not where it should have been, but it wasn't clearly stolen either. There were scuffs near the driver's side door, maybe old, maybe not. Tire tracks overlapped in the gravel, indistinct, a mess of maybes. A strange quiet settled over the scene, the kind that makes every sound feel too loud, every decision too heavy. Search teams fanned out at first light. Volunteers with flashlights combed fields and woods, their beams slicing through fog, calling her name until their throats burned. Dogs picked up a scent and lost it, circled back, lost it again. Helicopters beat the air overhead, the noise echoing across farmland, carrying hope and dread in equal measure. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, and the map of the search grew crowded with red lines and empty spaces. Each cleared area felt like progress and failure at the same time. Each unanswered question tightened the knot. As the investigation deepened, so did the unease. Interviews revealed a web of ordinary connections, co-workers, neighbors, casual acquaintances whose names appeared in notebooks and then faded. No obvious enemies. No dramatic threats. Just the quiet friction of daily life, small conflicts that meant everything and nothing depending on where you stood. Tips poured in, some earnest, some wild. A suspicious truck. A man seen loitering. A scream heard miles away, maybe from a television. Every lead demanded attention, and every dead end left another scar. The media arrived and with it the language of shock. Mysterious disappearance. Community rattled. Cold case looming. Cameras framed the empty road, the abandoned car, the worried faces. Headlines hardened the fear into something solid, something you could hold. The victim's photograph ran again and again, her eyes fixed on the lens, frozen at a moment before everything went wrong. For the family, time splintered. Birthdays passed uncelebrated. Holidays were endured. The phone rang, and every ring carried the weight of possibility. Somewhere between hope and exhaustion, they learned the rhythm of waiting. Inside the police department, the case grew thicker and colder. Files multiplied. Evidence bags were logged and shelved. Lab requests went out and came back inconclusive. In 1987, science moved at a different pace, and patience was a resource always in short supply. Investigators argued over theories late into the night, voices low, coffee bitter. Was it a crime of opportunity or someone who knew her routines too well? Did she leave willingly for a moment that turned irreversible, or was she forced into a choice she never made? Each hypothesis felt convincing until it wasn't. The town changed in subtle ways. Doors locked earlier. Parents walked their children to bus stops. Strangers were measured with new eyes. A sense of violation lingered, not tied to a place but to a feeling, the understanding that safety could evaporate without warning. The case became a reference point, a before and after. That was before she disappeared, people would say, as if the calendar itself had been broken. Months passed. Then years. The search scaled back. The tips slowed. New crimes demanded attention, new victims needed justice, and the reality set in with a dull ache, the case was slipping toward the cold. The file was moved, not closed, just relocated, a physical act that carried an emotional weight. The evidence remained, patient and mute. The questions remained sharper than ever. Somewhere in those boxes lay answers that could not yet speak. Every so often, something stirred the embers. A letter from a self-proclaimed witness. A rumor resurfacing. A detective with fresh eyes flipping through old reports, underlining phrases, circling dates. The family clung to these moments, small flares in the dark, but each time the light faded. The Ohio 1987 disappearance settled into legend, a cautionary tale whispered to newcomers, a wound that never quite healed. Then there was the evidence everyone thought they understood. Items catalogued and dismissed, notes made in margins decades ago. A fiber that matched nothing. A partial print smudged beyond use. A receipt misfiled. Details that seemed insignificant in the rush of the early days, overshadowed by the urgency of finding someone who might still be alive. As time passed, those details took on a different shape, like shadows shifting as the sun moved. Forgotten did not mean gone. It meant waiting. The detectives who had been there at the beginning retired or moved on, carrying pieces of the case with them like shrapnel. New investigators inherited the cold case, along with its weight and its warnings. They read the reports, listened to old interviews on crackling tapes, tried to hear what had been missed. Technology changed. Techniques evolved. What once seemed impossible began to feel merely difficult. And yet the silence held. The community marked anniversaries without ceremonies. The victim's name was etched into memory in stone, into the way people talked about their town. "It doesn't happen here," they used to say. Now they knew better. The case was not just unsolved, it was unresolved, a question mark hanging over decades, shaping the way fear traveled through generations. Late at night, when the office lights were low and the building breathed around them, a detective would pull the file and feel the familiar pull, the sense that the truth was close enough to touch if only the right angle could be found. Somewhere, a piece did not fit, and that misalignment mattered. Somewhere, a witness remembered something differently. Somewhere, a box held an item mislabeled, overlooked, underestimated. The case waited, as cold cases do, for the moment when time itself would become an ally rather than an enemy. In Ohio, 1987 never quite ended. It lingered in the spaces between facts, in the pauses after questions, in the quiet drive past the place where a car once sat with its door open to the cold. The town learned to live with the absence, to fold it into daily life, but it never forgot. And beneath the layers of dust and years, beneath the assumption that everything had already been tried, the forgotten evidence remained, unchanged, ready to do what it had always been capable of doing, change everything, if only someone listened closely enough. The file came back to the desk on a night when the building felt too large for the people inside it, fluorescent lights humming like insects, the city outside reduced to a grid of sodium glow and shadow. A new pair of hands opened the folder, not with reverence but with suspicion, the kind that asks what everyone else missed and why. Paper whispered as it turned. Polaroids stared back, colors dulled by time, a car frozen in the wrong place forever, gravel disturbed in ways that once meant nothing and now meant everything. This was the moment cold cases often pretended not to have, the quiet return, the unannounced second life. The detective lingered on the margins first, the notes scribbled by others decades earlier, shorthand born of urgency and fatigue. There were questions left half-answered, arrows pointing nowhere, assumptions hardened into fact because there hadn't been time to test them. A timeline sketched too neatly. A witness statement summarized instead of quoted. The past spoke softly, but it spoke. And the more the pages turned, the clearer it became that certainty had arrived too early in 1987, locking doors that should have stayed open. Outside the department, the world had changed. DNA databases had grown teeth. Software could stitch together patterns invisible to the naked eye. Old evidence, once inert, now had potential, like a battery charged and waiting. The detective requested boxes from storage, the kind that arrive with dust and resignation, the kind labeled in a handwriting no one recognized anymore. The evidence room coughed them up reluctantly. Inventory sheets were checked and rechecked. Some items were where they should be. Others were not. One envelope stood out because it looked ordinary, thin, yellowed, stamped with a date that meant nothing until it did. Inside were photographs of the car taken hours after discovery, angles wide and close, details meant to be exhaustive. A single image held the eye longer than the rest. The driver's side door frame, captured obliquely, showed a faint smear, a disturbance that could be dismissed as grime, or something else entirely. In 1987, it had been logged and shelved. No test requested. No follow-up. The rush had moved on. The detective didn't announce the find. Cold cases punish enthusiasm. Instead, a quiet request went out to the lab, phrased carefully, accompanied by a chain of custody explanation that stretched back through names and years. The technicians treated the material like an artifact, slow and precise, aware of the stakes. Time stretched again, familiar and unbearable. Meanwhile, interviews were reopened, voices summoned from memory and retirement. Some people refused. Some were eager, grateful to be asked again. Others had rehearsed their answers for decades, confident in their consistency. A former coworker spoke of a disagreement that night, nothing dramatic, just words sharpened by stress. A neighbor remembered a vehicle idling longer than necessary, a shape in the dark that never quite resolved. A clerk at a gas station corrected the time on a receipt, off by minutes that now mattered. Each adjustment nudged the timeline, loosening it, letting air in. The case began to breathe differently. The community felt the shift before it was named. Reporters sniffed around again, careful this time, older, less theatrical. The phrase cold case resurfaced, paired with reopened, and the town flinched. Families who had grown up in the shadow of the disappearance found themselves explaining it to their own children. Fear returned, not sharp but persistent, a reminder that the past was not done with them. At the lab, results arrived wrapped in caution. Not a miracle. Not a smoking gun. But something. A partial profile, incomplete yet distinct enough to rule out most of the people who had been considered and to raise the question no one wanted to ask, had the wrong assumptions protected the right suspect all along? The detective stared at the numbers, the probability statements, the careful language that science used to avoid promises. It was enough to keep going. It was enough to reopen doors. Attention shifted to the forgotten corners of the case, the peripheral figures who had hovered just outside the frame. A man who'd moved away months after the disappearance, timing once chalked up to coincidence. A vehicle registered under a relative's name, present in the area for reasons that no longer checked out. Employment records pulled from microfilm. Phone logs resurrected from backups no one expected to find. The web tightened slowly, methodically, resisting drama. Interviews took on a different tone now. Questions were asked twice, then again, phrased slightly differently, silence used as a tool. Memories frayed under pressure, contradictions surfaced. A story once told confidently now hesitated. Eyes shifted. Details changed. The detective watched for the moment when routine cracked, when rehearsed calm slipped and something real showed through. It didn't always come. But sometimes it did. The family was informed in measured terms. Progress, not resolution. Possibilities, not conclusions. They listened with the practiced stillness of people who had learned not to lean too hard into hope. Yet something changed in the room, a posture, a breath held differently. The idea that the case might move again, that the long night might finally be ending, was almost too much to touch. Pressure mounted behind the scenes. Prosecutors were briefed cautiously. Standards were higher now, expectations unforgiving. A case this old would be dissected in public, every misstep magnified. Evidence had to be airtight. The detective felt the weight of it, the responsibility not just to solve but to solve correctly. The past was watching. Then came the mistake, small and human, the kind cold cases thrive on. A report misread. A name conflated. A lead pursued too aggressively, tipping someone off. The trail cooled again, briefly, infuriatingly. Doubt crept back in. Had the case surged only to collapse under its own history? Nights grew longer. Coffee grew colder. The file sat open, daring anyone to close it again. It was a call from an unlikely source that shifted things. A retired officer, clearing out a garage, found a notebook he'd kept unofficially, observations he'd never formalized because they hadn't fit the prevailing theory. He spoke quietly, apologetically, aware of the time lost. The detective listened, pen still, heart loud. Names were mentioned. Places. A habit, a pattern of movement that intersected with the night in question like a faint crosshair. Cross-referencing began anew. Maps were layered. Distances recalculated. The ordinary geography of the town rearranged itself into something sinister, routes aligning too neatly to ignore. The vehicle cited by the neighbor matched a registration that had been overlooked because it belonged to someone tangential, someone trusted by association. The idea landed heavy and unwelcome. The lab results came back again, refined, narrowed. Still partial, still cautious, but stronger now, bolstered by new comparisons. The numbers shifted. The odds tightened. The detective felt the case tip, just slightly, toward gravity. This was how breakthroughs actually happened, not with thunder but with accumulation, the slow convergence of facts that refused to stay separate. The town held its breath without knowing it. Old rumors resurfaced, sharpened by time into certainties that were anything but. People watched each other more closely again, measuring reactions to the news, scanning faces at grocery stores and school events. The disappearance, once a distant ache, was suddenly present, alive, demanding attention. Late one night, the detective returned to the photograph of the door frame, the smear that had started it all. Under new light, magnified, contextualized, it looked less like chance and more like contact. The past leaned forward, insistent. Somewhere between what had been seen and what had been ignored, the truth waited, patient and unforgiving, ready for the moment when the right question finally landed and refused to let go. By the time the warrant request took shape, the case had acquired a second shadow, the kind cast by expectation. Everyone involved knew what it would mean to get this wrong. An arrest built on old bones and new science could resurrect the past or bury it deeper. The detective rewrote the affidavit again and again, shaving certainty down to what could be proven, threading cause through decades without snapping it. Dates mattered. Distances mattered. Language mattered most of all. In cold cases, verbs could kill prosecutions. The suspect's name sat on the page like a weight. It was not new, just newly unavoidable. In 1987, he had been present without being present, near without being near, known without being known. He fit the town the way furniture fits a room, always there, never questioned. He'd fixed things for people, lent tools, shared beers. He'd been helpful. He'd been forgettable. The kind of man you waved to without remembering why you knew him. The kind of man who survived scrutiny by blending into it. Surveillance began quietly, modernized tracking old habits. The suspect moved through life with the confidence of someone who believed the past had settled. He worked. He shopped. He smiled at clerks. His routines were steady, practiced, almost comforting. There were no dramatic tells, no midnight drives to nowhere, no slips that begged for interpretation. If guilt lived here, it lived deep, under layers of ordinary behavior, insulated by time. The detective focused on pressure points instead. Financial records first, pulled and aligned, looking for anomalies buried in years of transactions. A payment here, an unexplained withdrawal there. Nothing explosive. Enough to suggest patterns. Phone records followed, modern calls traced backward through accounts and archives until the night in question came into view again. A call placed and erased from memory. A tower ping that made sense only if you wanted it not to. Witnesses were approached with care. Not the ones who'd already spoken, but the ones adjacent to them, people whose stories had been footnotes. A friend of a friend. A coworker's spouse. The circles widened, intersected. Someone remembered a ride offered and declined. Someone else remembered an argument that wasn't supposed to be remembered at all. The detective learned to listen for the hesitation before the answer, the pause where truth and convenience wrestled. The family watched from a distance, learning news in fragments. Progress leaked despite best efforts, carried by whispers and glances, by the sudden politeness of officials who'd learned the value of tone. They asked careful questions and received careful answers. It was happening again, the reopening of a wound they'd learned to live around. Hope returned like a familiar ache, unwelcome and irresistible. At the lab, the partial profile was pushed as far as it could go. New comparisons were authorized, permissions granted that hadn't existed before. The science was honest about its limits, precise about its claims. This wasn't certainty. It was direction. It was a narrowing of the world to a corridor that pointed somewhere specific. The detective accepted the trade-off. In this case, direction was enough. The warrant came back signed on a gray morning that felt rehearsed. The search would be limited, surgical. No spectacle. No leaks. The suspect's home was approached with the same care you'd give a sleeping animal. Inside, the rooms were neat, curated, artifacts of a life lived carefully. Photographs lined shelves. Tools hung in order. Nothing obvious. That was the danger. Cold cases rarely reveal themselves to the untrained eye. Evidence collection moved methodically. Clothing from boxes long sealed. Items kept for reasons even the owner might not articulate anymore. A vehicle that had changed colors twice since the 80s, its history disguised beneath coats of paint and years of maintenance. Each piece was tagged, logged, treated with respect for what it might contain. Respect for what it might say. The suspect watched calmly, answering questions with practiced ease. He offered coffee. He laughed at the idea of relevance, shrugged at dates he claimed not to remember. He spoke about the town the way people do when they believe they belong to it, when they believe it belongs to them. The detective noted the language, the ownership implied in casual phrases. Small things. Always small things. Days later, the lab called again. Not with fireworks. With alignment. The partial profile matched in a way that was difficult to explain away, a statistical overlap that pressed hard against coincidence. The smear on the door frame found a context. Contact became contact with a name attached. The detective closed the door to his office and sat with it, letting the weight settle. This was the pivot cold case's dream of in dread in equal measure. Prosecutors were briefed under strict conditions. The presentation was blunt, unadorned. Strengths laid bare. Weaknesses acknowledged. The age of the case was both enemy and ally, its gaps a risk, its persistence a narrative juries could understand. The decision took hours that felt like days. In the end, caution prevailed alongside resolve. Move forward. But carefully. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic. No flashing lights. No dramatic takedown. Just a knock, a conversation, a moment when routine broke and something else took its place. The suspect listened as rights were read, face unreadable. If there was shock, it stayed hidden. If there was relief, it stayed buried deeper. The town learned through the afternoon news cycle, anchors choosing words that balanced restraint with impact. Ohio. 1987, cold case. Arrest made. Community stunned. Reaction fractured along predictable lines. Some people felt vindicated, their old suspicions finally validated. Others recoiled, defending the man they thought they knew, the version of him that had helped them move furniture and fix fences. The truth threatened to split the town along fault lines drawn decades earlier. Memory proved unreliable. Loyalty proved loud. Interrogation unfolded without theatrics. The detective laid out the evidence slowly, letting silence do the work it had always done best. The suspect listened, corrected minor details, denied the rest. He offered alternative explanations, reasonable ones, rehearsed ones. He spoke of the smear as coincidence, of proximity as chance, of time as something that eroded accuracy. He was not wrong about time. He was wrong about everything else. Hours passed. The room stayed cool. The detective watched for the crack, the moment when the weight of accumulated facts pressed too hard to resist. It came not as confession but as deflection, a sudden fixation on an unrelated detail, an attempt to steer the narrative elsewhere. Cold cases teach patience. The detective waited. Outside, the family gathered in a living room they'd learned to rearrange around grief. They watched the coverage with cautious eyes, recognizing faces they hadn't seen in years. They spoke little. There was nothing to say yet. Justice, if it came, would arrive on its own schedule. The evidence continued to line up, not perfectly, but insistently. A tool mark matched an old injury on the car. Soil analysis tied a location to a shoe that had been dismissed as unremarkable. Each piece nudged the story closer to coherence. The past resisted, as it always did, but it was losing ground. By nightfall, the suspect asked for a break. He stared at the table as if it might offer answers he hadn't prepared. When he spoke again, his voice was flatter, less certain. He did not confess. He did not need to. In cold cases, the truth often emerges without ceremony, revealed through the collapse of alternatives rather than a single admission. The town slept uneasily, aware that something irreversible had begun. The arrest was not the end. It was an opening, a tearing of the veil that had kept 1987 at a manageable distance. Tomorrow would bring arguments and hearings in doubt. Tomorrow would test whether forgotten evidence could truly change everything. For now, the case exhaled. The long silence had been broken, not by a shout, but by a careful accumulation of facts that refused to be ignored. Somewhere between what was proven and what was still believed, the story moved forward, dragging the past with it into a light it had avoided for nearly 4 decades. The courtroom smelled like varnish and old paper, a place designed to feel permanent even as the truth inside it shifted. When the case was formally named aloud, when the year 1987 was spoken into a microphone that hadn't existed back then, the sound rippled through the room like a dropped glass. This was no longer a rumor, no longer a reopened file whispered about in hallways. This was the Ohio 1987 cold case stepping into public light, dragging its shadows with it. Defense attorneys moved quickly, as they always do when time is their sharpest weapon. Motions were filed questioning the integrity of evidence, the sanctity of chains of custody that stretched across decades, the reliability of memories that had aged alongside regret. They spoke calmly, methodically, their voices trained to sow doubt without ever raising them. They reminded the court that justice delayed is justice distorted, that science evolves but certainty does not travel backward easily. It was a familiar dance, and the detective watched it with the tired eyes of someone who knew every step. Prosecutors countered with restraint. They did not promise closure. They did not overreach. They spoke instead of convergence, of how disparate elements had finally aligned, of how the smear on the car door frame had waited patiently for technology to catch up, of how forgotten evidence did not decay the way assumptions did. They spoke of diligence, of reopening doors that should never have been closed, of a community that deserved answers even if it had learned to live without them. The victim's family sat together, a quiet island amid murmurs. They had prepared themselves for this moment in theory and discovered preparation meant nothing in practice. Faces they hadn't seen since the early days reappeared, older, altered by time and guilt. The past crowded the room, heavy and intimate. When the victim's name was spoken, it landed differently now, no longer just a memory but a case number with teeth. Outside, the town argued with itself. Talk radio crackled with opinion. Social gatherings thinned as people chose sides, often without admitting it. Some insisted the arrest was overdue justice. Others warned of scapegoats and rushed conclusions. The suspect's family kept their heads down, navigating a sudden isolation that felt both new and eerily familiar to those who'd lived under suspicion before. Old friendships bent or broke under the strain. The evidence took the stand in pieces, introduced carefully, almost apologetically. Photographs first, then objects, then expert testimony that translated numbers into meaning. The smear became a story of contact and location, its significance framed not as revelation but as correction. This was not something new discovered, it was something old finally understood. Jurors leaned in despite themselves, aware that they were being asked to bridge a gap of nearly 40 years with reason alone. Cross-examination was ruthless. Every assumption was questioned. Every delay was highlighted. Why wasn't this tested then? Why wasn't that followed up? The prosecution answered without defensiveness, acknowledging the failures of the past without allowing them to eclipse the present. The detective took the stand and spoke plainly, resisting the urge to defend history. He spoke instead of persistence, of refusing to accept that time could erase responsibility. Witnesses followed, some steady, some shaken. Memories collided with records. A timeline once considered fixed softened, then reshaped itself in front of the jury. A neighbor's recollection, dismissed years ago as unreliable, found support in a receipt corrected by minutes. A route described casually now intersected with tower data that had not existed when the night first went quiet. The case was not rebuilt, it was reassembled, piece by piece, with visible seams. The defense pressed hardest on motive. Why now? Why then? They offered alternative narratives, plausible enough to linger. They suggested coincidence dressed up as science, community fear retrofitted into certainty. They reminded the jury that absence of evidence is not evidence of guilt. The room listened, absorbing the tension, aware that doubt was the currency of justice. Late one afternoon, the suspect took the stand. He spoke with the same careful tone he'd used in interrogation, the same ownership of ordinary life. He denied wrongdoing without drama, recast proximity as happenstance, familiarity as coincidence. He spoke of kindnesses rendered, of years lived quietly. He did not rage. He did not beg. He trusted the passage of time to blur edges, to soften accusations. For a moment, the room felt uncertain again. Then the prosecution introduced the detail that shifted the air. A minor inconsistency, small enough to miss without context, large enough to matter once seen. A statement about a tool kept in a place it had not been kept until after the disappearance. A fact no one could have known unless they had been there, unless memory betrayed rehearsal. The jurors looked at one another, not dramatically, just enough to register the shift. Cold cases turn on moments like this, not explosions but alignments. Closing arguments arrived like weather fronts. The defense urged caution, restraint, the humility to admit what could not be known. The prosecution asked for courage, the willingness to accept that time does not absolve, that forgotten evidence does not forget. They spoke of the night Ohio went quiet and the years that followed, of a community suspended between fear and hope. They asked not for revenge but for recognition. Deliberations stretched into days. The town waited again, relearning the old posture. News vans idled. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. The family returned to their living room, the same one that had hosted decades of waiting, and sat with the television muted, watching light change across familiar walls. The detective returned to his office and closed the door, aware that whatever happened next would not undo the past, only reframe it. When the verdict came, it arrived without ceremony. A word spoken clearly, recorded officially, absorbed slowly. Some people cried. Others stared. The room did not erupt. It exhaled. Justice, when it finally shows up in cold cases, is often quiet, careful not to promise more than it can deliver. Sentencing would come later. Appeals would follow. The legal machinery would continue its measured grind. But the case had crossed a threshold. The Ohio 1987 cold case was no longer an open wound bleeding into rumor. It was a scar, still tender, still visible, but named. Outside the courthouse, the town tried to remember how to talk about itself. The disappearance would never vanish from memory, but it had changed shape. Fear loosened its grip just enough to let something else in, relief, perhaps, or the beginning of peace. The forgotten evidence had done its work, not by shouting, but by insisting. And yet, as night fell and the streets emptied, the truth lingered with an edge. Cold cases never really end. They settle. They leave questions behind, echoes that resist silence. Ohio would carry 1987 with it always, not as a mystery anymore, but as a reminder of what happens when time is challenged, when the past is called forward and forced, finally, to answer. The sentence did not close the story, it shifted its weight. In the weeks that followed, the town learned how verdicts echo, how a single word spoken in a courtroom can ripple outward and unsettle lives that thought themselves untouched. The Ohio 1987 cold case had been given an ending by law, but memory resisted the simplicity of closure. People replayed moments they thought they understood, recasting old conversations, reinterpreting silences. Justice had arrived, and with it, a different kind of unease. The suspect, now a convicted man, was moved through the system with procedural efficiency. Intake. Processing. A photograph taken under harsh light, the face older than the crime but newly defined by it. Appeals were announced almost immediately, expected and necessary, a reminder that certainty is always provisional. His family navigated the aftermath quietly, learning the contours of a stigma they had not chosen. Some believed in his innocence still. Others did not know what to believe. Loyalty fractured under the strain of facts that refused to bend. The victim's family experienced relief as a complicated emotion, one that arrived tangled with grief. They had waited decades for answers and discovered that answers did not restore what had been lost. They offered statements that balanced gratitude with restraint, careful not to claim healing where there was none. Cameras captured their composure, mistaking it for closure. At home, photographs were revisited, stories told again, the past rearranged now that it had an ending of sorts. Behind the scenes, the case continued to unfold. Sentencing hearings brought new details to the surface, fragments of context that had not fit cleanly into the trial narrative. A witness recalled a late-night call never logged. A former associate admitted to a favor done without questions asked. None of it overturned the verdict, but all of it added texture, depth to a story that had been flattened by years of rumor. The truth grew heavier, not lighter, as it expanded. The detective returned to the file with a different purpose now. No longer hunting for proof, he looked for understanding, for lessons that could be carried forward. He annotated margins with observations meant for no one in particular, reminders of where certainty had arrived too early, where skepticism should have lingered. Cold cases teach humility, he thought. They punish haste and reward patience, but only if someone is willing to keep asking after everyone else has stopped. Training sessions followed, quiet meetings where the case was dissected not for drama but for method. Younger investigators listened as the story was stripped of its narrative sheen and reduced to decisions, missteps, opportunities missed. The smear on the doorframe became a symbol, not of neglect, but of timing, of how evidence waits without aging while interpretation does. The lesson was simple and brutal: nothing is insignificant forever. The town adjusted unevenly. Some streets felt lighter, conversations less guarded. Others carried a new tension, a sense that the familiar had been compromised. The places associated with the disappearance, roads, parking lots, wooded edges, were re-entered cautiously, as if geography itself needed to be relearned. Memorials were updated, dates engraved with the finality of stone. The past was acknowledged publicly, no longer whispered. Media attention waned, as it always does, replaced by newer stories with sharper edges. The cold case receded from headlines, settling into archives and true crime retrospectives. Yet for those who lived it, the case remained present, a reference point that shaped how they understood safety, trust, and time. The town had been changed not just by the crime, but by the waiting, by the years spent suspended between fear and forgetting. Appeals moved forward methodically, arguments refined, precedents cited. Defense teams challenged the science again, the chain of custody again, the reliability of convergence itself. Courts listened, weighed, responded. The process was slow, intentionally so, a counterbalance to the speed with which assumptions had once hardened. Each decision reaffirmed the verdict without celebrating it, a quiet endorsement of persistence over spectacle. The detective watched from a distance, aware that his role had ended but his responsibility had not. He spoke rarely about the case now, choosing words with care when he did. He had learned that endings invite scrutiny, that solved cases are judged more harshly than unsolved ones because they dare to claim truth. He accepted that. Cold cases earn their conclusions through endurance, not applause. The victim's name appeared in print again one final time, attached to a scholarship fund established quietly by the family. It was not an attempt at legacy, just an offering, a way to translate loss into something forward-moving. The announcement passed without fanfare, noticed by those who needed to notice it. The family did not attend the ceremony. They had done enough standing in public. Years later, the case would be referenced in textbooks and podcasts, compressed into an arc that fit comfortably within an hour. Listeners would marvel at the patience, the technology, the forgotten evidence that changed everything. They would ask why it took so long, how something so small could matter so much. The answers would be partial, unsatisfying. Real life resists clean explanations. On quiet nights, when the town lay still and the roads emptied early, some residents claimed they could feel the difference, a subtle shift in the air. Others felt nothing at all. Both reactions were true. Closure is not a universal experience, it is personal, uneven, shaped by proximity to pain. The Ohio 1987 cold case did not end with a verdict. It settled into history, layered and complex, a reminder etched into collective memory. Forgotten evidence had changed everything, yes, but what it changed most was the understanding of time itself, of how long truth can wait, and how loudly it speaks when someone finally listens. And in that understanding, the town moved forward, not free of the past, but no longer defined by its silence, carrying the weight of 1987 with a steadier grip, aware now that even the quietest details can one day demand to be heard. Time did what it always does after the noise fades, it rearranged priorities without asking permission. Months slipped into years, and the Ohio 1987 cold case transformed again, this time from lived crisis into institutional memory. Files were archived with updated labels. Evidence was resealed with modern tags. The case was cited in briefings as a success, though no one used the word lightly. Success felt too clean for something that had taken so much. The convicted man settled into a routine behind concrete walls, days measured by counts and lights and the dull repetition of sanctioned hours. He maintained his innocence in carefully worded letters, appeals drafted with professional precision. Some inmates listened. Others did not. In prison, stories circulate like currency, and has carried weight not because it was dramatic, but because it was old. A crime that had waited nearly 4 decades to be named commanded a certain respect, a cautionary tale whispered during yard time. Time, even here, was not done with him. The victim's family learned how to exist without anticipation. For years, hope had been an active state, something that demanded energy. Now it receded, replaced by a quieter vigilance. They noticed small freedoms returning, sleep uninterrupted by imagined phone calls, conversations that did not orbit the case. Yet anniversaries still arrived with a familiar heaviness. Dates have a way of asserting themselves, of reminding the body what the mind pretends to forget. In the department, the detective's annotations circulated informally. Copies of the timeline, now corrected and expanded, found their way into training binders. New recruits studied the case not for its drama, but for its restraint, for the moments when restraint had failed. The smear on the door frame appeared again, projected onto screens, its meaning unpacked slowly. Instructors paused there, letting silence do what lectures could not. Evidence does not shout, they reminded their audience. It waits. Other cold cases stirred in response. The success had an unintended consequence, expectation. Families called again, asking whether forgotten evidence might exist for them too, whether technology might yet bend time in their favor. Some cases moved forward. Many did not. Resources were finite. Hope, once rekindled, proved difficult to manage. The detective felt this weight keenly, aware that reopening one door inevitably left others closed. The town's relationship with law enforcement shifted subtly. Trust, eroded by years of unanswered questions, did not return all at once. It grew in increments, fragile and conditional. Community meetings drew larger crowds, questions sharper but less accusatory. People wanted to understand process now, not just outcomes. They wanted to know how to live alongside uncertainty without letting it calcify into fear. The places tied to the case changed ownership. A diner closed, reopened under new management, its counter replaced, its walls repainted. The stretch of road where the car had been found was resurfaced, the gravel long gone, the shoulder widened for safety. No marker indicated its significance. Those who knew did not need one. Memory does not require signage. Appeals continued their slow progression, arguments refined, language sharpened. At each stage, the past was summoned again, questioned again, asked to justify itself. Courts acknowledged the age of the case without allowing it to dominate the analysis. The verdict held. Each denial of appeal reinforced a quiet finality, though no one involved pretended that finality meant peace. The detective retired without ceremony. His last day passed like any other, desk cleared, badge turned in, a few handshakes exchanged. He took no souvenirs from the case, only the knowledge that persistence mattered even when it felt indulgent. In retirement, he avoided interviews, declined invitations to speak publicly. The story no longer belonged to him, if it ever had. Years later, a journalist uncovered the case while researching another disappearance. She traced its arc backward, intrigued by the long silence between beginning and end. Her article focused less on the crime itself and more on the waiting, on how communities metabolize uncertainty. Readers responded in unexpected ways, sharing their own stories of unresolved loss. The Ohio case became a mirror, reflecting grief beyond its borders. The victim's scholarship fund grew modestly, sustained by quiet donations. Recipients wrote thank you letters that spoke of futures imagined and pursued. The family read them privately, choosing not to attend ceremonies. This was not about recognition. It was about continuity, about asserting that something forward-moving could emerge from a past defined by interruption. On certain nights, when the weather matched that autumn in 1987, cold, metallic, unyielding, residents reported an unease they could not quite name. Perhaps it was habit. Perhaps it was memory. Or perhaps it was the understanding that answers, once given, do not erase the questions that shaped them. The town had learned this slowly, painfully. The Ohio 1987 cold case lived on not as a warning, but as a lesson. It taught that evidence does not age the way people do, that truth can be patient without being kind, that silence is not absence but accumulation. Forgotten evidence had changed everything once. It continued to do so in quieter ways, altering how people listened, how they waited, how they refused to let time decide what mattered. And somewhere in the steady march of days, between ordinary mornings and unremarkable nights, the case settled into the background of collective life, not forgotten, not feared, but acknowledged, a reminder that even after the noise fades, the past keeps watch, ready for the moment when someone, somewhere, decides to look again. Years after the verdict, the case resurfaced in a way no one had anticipated, not through appeal or confession, but through absence. A routine audit of the evidence vault turned up a discrepancy so small it might have gone unnoticed in any other context, an item logged, sealed, and never fully examined because it was assumed to belong to a different timeline. A scrap, miscategorized decades earlier, filed under property rather than forensic material. It had survived moves, floods, reorganizations. It had waited. The call went out quietly. The department did not announce a reopening, they used another word instead, review. It sounded safer, less disruptive. The retired detective was notified out of courtesy. He listened without comment, recognizing the tone. This was not alarm. This was curiosity sharpened by experience. Cold cases, even solved ones, have a way of testing certainty long after the law has spoken. The item was unremarkable at first glance, a fragment of fabric, threadbare at the edges, its color dulled to something between gray and memory. In 1987, it had been assumed to be debris from the roadside, swept up with other detritus. No one had asked where it came from or how it arrived there. The assumption had been enough. Now, under modern protocols, assumption felt like negligence. Testing was authorized without fanfare. The lab approached the fragment with the same caution reserved for relics. Fibers were isolated, cataloged, compared. The results did not contradict the verdict. They complicated it. The material matched clothing the victim was known to have worn, yes, but it also bore traces of something else, something that had not been part of the narrative. Another fiber, synthetic, uncommon in the region at the time, linked to a manufacturing batch distributed far from Ohio. Maps came out again. Distribution routes were traced. Purchase records were sought and mostly failed to appear, lost to time and privacy laws. Still, the implication lingered. The fragment suggested movement, contact beyond the established frame. It suggested that the night in question might have included a stop no one had considered, a place unexamined because it sat just outside the search radius drawn in 1987. The department faced a choice familiar to anyone who works with the past: leave it alone or follow it. They chose the latter, not because they doubted the verdict, but because doubt had become a discipline. The review expanded cautiously, careful not to ignite speculation. The family was informed in the gentlest possible terms. They listened, tired but attentive, understanding that truth sometimes arrives in installments. Investigators revisited locations dismissed decades earlier, now altered by development and neglect. A storage facility converted into apartments. A vacant lot that had once held a service station, its underground tanks long removed. Ground-penetrating radar traced patterns beneath asphalt and grass, revealing disturbances that could be anything or nothing. Each site carried the same weight, possibility without promise. Interviews resumed with people who had already testified, their statements now contextualized differently. No accusations were leveled. No theories announced. Questions focused on routes, errands, deviations from routine. A former attendant at the old service station remembered a late customer, a woman matching the victim's description, anxious, asking for directions. The memory had surfaced only after the article, only after the case had taught her that small details matter. Her certainty was fragile, but it existed. The convicted man's attorneys seized on the development, filing motions that framed the fragment as exculpatory, as proof of investigative tunnel vision. The courts listened, measured, asked whether the new information undermined the convergence that had secured the verdict. Experts testified again, explaining probability, context, the difference between complication and contradiction. The legal process flexed, absorbing the shock without breaking. Public reaction was muted, restrained by fatigue. True crime forums buzzed, dissecting every update, weaving new narratives with old threads. The town itself remained cautious. It had learned not to leap. It waited, watching the review proceed with a wary calm that bordered on resignation. Closure, it turned out, had been provisional all along. The retired detective returned to the evidence vault once more, moving slowly, reading labels like a language he still spoke fluently. He did not feel betrayed by the fragment. He felt validated. Cold cases, he believed, are never solved so much as they are stabilized. They settle until disturbed, then reveal another layer. The goal is not finality, but fidelity to the truth, however many passes it requires. The lab's findings were published internally, their language precise and unprovocative. The fragment indicated secondary contact. It suggested a chain of events more complex than previously understood. It did not name a new suspect. It did not erase the old one. It asked the question instead: who else was present, and why had their trace endured? The family grappled with the news privately. They had mourned one version of the past and now faced another. The idea that the final hours might have unfolded differently than they had imagined reopened old corridors of thought. They chose not to speak publicly, trusting that the review would either resolve itself or recede. Waiting, they had learned, was a skill. As months passed, the review narrowed. No additional remains were found. No hidden locations yielded answers. The fragment remained the outlier, a reminder that even careful narratives leave things behind. The courts denied the latest motions, citing the strength of the original convergence. The verdict stood, again. Yet the case had changed. It had expanded, accommodating ambiguity without collapsing. The Ohio 1987 cold case now carried a footnote, a reminder that certainty is layered, that even forgotten evidence can return to ask different questions than the ones it answered before. In the end, the fragment was refiled correctly, its label updated, its presence acknowledged. It did not overturn history. It enriched it. The case settled once more, not into silence, but into a deeper, more honest quiet, the kind that allows for complexity without surrendering to doubt. And in that quiet, the town continued, aware now more than ever that truth is not a single moment of revelation, but a process, patient, relentless, and always capable of surprise. The review ended without ceremony, the way most truths do when they refuse to resolve cleanly. No press conference. No statements heavy with implication. Just a memo circulated, a handful of signatures, and the quiet understanding that the Ohio 1987 cold case had reached another plateau rather than an endpoint. The fragment had been acknowledged, contextualized, absorbed. The story did not collapse. It deepened. Life in the town continued with a new kind of caution, not fear exactly, but awareness sharpened by experience. People spoke differently now when they talked about the past, leaving space for uncertainty instead of filling it with certainty borrowed from headlines. The disappearance was no longer a single narrative told the same way each time. It had become layered, a palimpsest of versions written over one another, none fully erased. The convicted man's appeals slowed, their language growing narrower, more technical. His world contracted to procedure and precedent, to the small victories of routine. He followed the review through second-hand reports, parsing every word for leverage. When none arrived, his statements grew quieter. Innocence, maintained too long without reinforcement, becomes a private thing. Time continued its work on him, reshaping anger into something duller, less performative. For investigators still active in the department, the case became a reference point that refused to fade. New files crossed their desks, and inevitably someone would say it aloud, not as a boast but as a warning: remember Ohio. Remember what waited. The lesson was not optimism. It was discipline. Assume nothing. Catalog everything. Leave doors open longer than feels comfortable. A new disappearance miles away briefly drew comparisons, the media hungry for patterns. Detectives pushed back, careful to avoid manufacturing echoes where none existed. The Ohio case had taught them how easily coincidence becomes narrative when fear is involved. The new investigation followed its own course, and the town exhaled again, reminded that not every shadow belonged to the same night. The family marked another anniversary privately, as they always had. The number no longer shocked, it simply existed. They visited the cemetery without cameras, stood without speeches. What had changed was not the weight of the loss, but the shape of it. The story they carried now included effort, persistence, and the knowledge that silence had not been the final answer. It did not make the absence easier. It made it different. Academics took interest in the case, citing it in journals and conferences devoted to forensic evolution and investigative bias. Slides showed timelines annotated with what-if markers, moments where a different choice might have accelerated the truth. The case was dissected clinically, stripped of emotion, then reassembled as theory. Those who lived it recognized the skeleton but not the flesh. Real cases, they knew, do not move the way diagrams do. True crime culture continued its quiet consumption, podcasts revisiting the case with updated footnotes, hosts marveling at the endurance of evidence and the patience of time. Listeners debated interpretations late into the night, constructing certainty from distance. The town rarely listened. It had learned the difference between engagement and exposure. One evening, years later, a letter arrived at the department without a return address. Inside was nothing dramatic, just a few lines written carefully, deliberately. The author claimed no involvement, offered no confession. Instead, they referenced a detail not widely known, a turn taken that night for reasons unclear even now. The letter ended without request, without threat. It was logged, analyzed, debated. Handwriting yielded nothing conclusive. The postmark told only where it had been sent from, not why. The letter did not reopen the case. It joined the archive, another quiet artifact among many, another reminder that some people carry pieces of history they never fully release. The detective who reviewed it felt no frustration, only recognition. This was the nature of cold cases, they attract fragments long after the central story has been decided, each one testing the edges. In the town, a new generation grew up with the case as background knowledge rather than lived fear. They learned it in school projects and local history units, framed as a lesson in persistence and caution. The disappearance became part of identity, not trauma but context. Something that had happened here, something that had shaped how people watched out for one another. The places tied to the case faded further into anonymity. The road where the car had been found blended into daily commutes. The service station existed only in photographs and memory. Time reclaimed geography the way it always does, indifferent to meaning. Only those who knew looked twice, felt the faint pull of association. The Ohio 1987 cold case settled again, this time with an asterisk rather than a question mark. Solved, but not simple. Closed, but not complete. The forgotten evidence had done more than change everything once, it had changed how everything after it was understood. It had taught the town to live with answers that did not silence curiosity. And in that living, something unexpected emerged, resilience without denial. The ability to acknowledge that truth can arrive in pieces, that justice can be firm without being final, that the past does not stay put simply because it has been named. The case waited still, not for resolution, but for relevance, ready to speak again if called upon. Cold cases never sleep. They rest lightly, attentive, aware that time, far from being an enemy, is often the last witness standing. The years that followed taught a harder lesson, one that did not fit neatly into training manuals or anniversary speeches, that even after a cold case is named, argued, and decided, it continues to move beneath the surface, altering how people behave when they think no one is watching. The Ohio 1987 cold case had become a reference, but it had also become a lens, quietly reshaping judgment long after the headlines had thinned to dust. In the department, a subtle shift took hold. Investigators began to question their instincts more openly, to challenge one another without defensiveness. Meetings slowed. Timelines were redrawn and redrawn again, not because they were wrong, but because no one wanted them to become unquestionable. The case had shown what certainty could cost. Now doubt was treated not as weakness, but as a tool. Evidence rooms changed too. New policies were written in dry language that carried the weight of experience. Items once considered peripheral were logged differently, stored with an eye toward futures no one could predict. Labels grew more detailed. Assumptions were banned from margins. Somewhere in those procedural shifts lived the quiet legacy of a fragment that had waited decades to be seen correctly. The town absorbed these changes without naming them. People noticed officers spending more time listening than talking, more time asking than concluding. Trust did not return as gratitude. It returned as participation. Tips came in earlier. Witnesses spoke with less hesitation. The memory of silence, of how long it had taken to break, remained a cautionary pressure behind every interaction. The family felt the shift in smaller ways. A neighbor who had once avoided the topic now mentioned the victim's name without lowering their voice. A local paper ran a retrospective that did not sensationalize, that focused instead on the years of waiting, the discipline of patience. It was the first time the family felt represented rather than displayed. They clipped the article and stored it with others, a record of how the story had matured. Inside the prison system, the convicted man's world narrowed further. Appeals exhausted themselves against precedent and probability. The language of his petitions grew brittle, repeating phrases that had once carried hope. In letters to supporters, he returned to memory, to the idea that truth, if patient enough, would surface again. He was not entirely wrong. He was also not redeemed by the thought. The fragment, the letter, the footnotes, these things remained in the file, inert but present. New investigators occasionally encountered them and paused, feeling the weight of inherited complexity. They learned to sit with it, to resist the urge to resolve what did not need resolving. Cold cases, they were told, are not puzzles to be finished. They are systems to be understood. Elsewhere, the case influenced policy discussions far beyond Ohio. Conferences cited it when arguing for expanded evidence retention laws, for funding allocated not just to new investigations but to old ones waiting in the dark. Lawmakers referenced it obliquely, careful not to promise miracles. The case had proven what persistence could do, but it had also exposed the limits of correction. Not everything lost could be recovered. Not every delay could be undone. One autumn evening, long after the review had closed, a former classmate of the victim spoke at a community forum. She had never testified, never been interviewed. She talked instead about the way the disappearance had shaped her choices, the routes she avoided, the trust she withheld. Her voice did not shake. She was not asking for anything. She was naming a consequence that had lived quietly for decades. The room listened in a way it once had not. That night, the town felt different again, not lighter, not heavier, but more honest. The case was no longer an interruption in its history. It was part of its structure, a beam that had bent under pressure and held. The fear that once defined the disappearance had thinned, replaced by something steadier, vigilance without panic, memory without obsession. The Ohio 1987 cold case did not fade. It redistributed itself. It lived in policies and habits, in the way questions were framed, in the patience people learned to practice. It lived in the knowledge that truth is rarely a single reveal, more often a slow correction, a series of small alignments that finally refuse to be ignored. And somewhere, in a box marked with dates and revisions, the evidence waited as it always had, not for vindication, but for relevance. The case had taught everyone involved that relevance changes, that what matters most may not be what shouts the loudest, but what endures. As another year turned and the town prepared for winter, the memory of 1987 no longer arrived with shock. It arrived with recognition. A reminder that the past does not stay buried simply because it is old, and that the quietest details, once forgotten, can shape generations long after the night they first appeared. The story continued, not forward, not backward, but outward, touching lives that had never known the original fear, teaching them, indirectly, how to listen when silence seems complete, and how to wait for truth without assuming it has already finished speaking. By the time the case reached its fourth decade in memory, it had become something less volatile and more instructive, like a scar you stop touching but never forget is there. The Ohio 1987 cold case no longer sparked arguments in diners or speculation at town halls. Instead, it surfaced in quieter moments, when someone hesitated before locking a door, when a detective paused before closing a file, when a parent explained to a teenager why routines mattered even when nothing seemed wrong. The institutions shaped by the case continued to evolve. Evidence audits became ritual rather than response, carried out with a patience born of hard lessons. Digital systems replaced paper, but the philosophy remained analog: nothing leaves the story until it has been asked every possible question. Supervisors repeated the mantra without irony. Cold cases don't fail all at once, they said. They fail by degrees. The word stuck. New investigators who studied the case felt a strange distance from it, as if it belonged to another era, not just technologically but emotionally. The urgency of 1987, the panic, the blind spots, felt foreign to them. And yet the mistakes were familiar. Overconfidence. Compression. The temptation to declare narrative too soon. The case warned them without accusing them, a quiet presence at the back of the room. The town itself aged. Businesses changed hands. Streets were renamed. People who had been children when the car was found now walked their own children past the same intersections, unaware of how heavy those corners once felt. The story lived on in fragments, in second-hand explanations softened by time. Not forgotten. Just integrated. The family continued their private observances, no longer expecting acknowledgement. Grief had settled into a shape that allowed movement. They spoke of the victim without bracing for impact, shared memories that were no longer interrupted by speculation. The verdict, imperfect as it was, had given them permission to remember her life instead of endlessly revisiting her absence. That, more than any legal outcome, felt like progress. Inside prison walls, the man convicted in the case watched the world narrow and repeat. Years erased urgency from his claims, leaving them brittle, ritualized. New inmates knew him not as a name from headlines but as a fixture, someone whose story was told without embellishment. A cold case, they would say. Took them forever. The phrase carried both awe and warning. Occasionally, correspondents arrived at the department from armchair investigators convinced they had found the missing key, the overlooked accomplice, the conspiracy no one wanted to see. Each letter was logged, reviewed, answered when appropriate. None altered the trajectory. But none were dismissed casually either. The case had trained everyone involved to respect persistence, even when it led nowhere. The scholarship fund quietly crossed a milestone, its impact measurable not in publicity but in trajectories changed. Recipients moved on to careers that had nothing to do with crime or justice, and everything to do with continuity. The family read updates sent by administrators and felt, for the first time, something close to peace that did not feel like surrender. The case entered academic folklore, cited alongside others that had survived decades of neglect and assumption. Panels debated whether it represented triumph or cautionary tale. Most agreed it was both. It demonstrated what technology could rescue and what human certainty could endanger. It became shorthand for a truth no one liked to say aloud: solving something late does not undo the cost of not solving it sooner. On the anniversary that marked nearly 40 years since the night Ohio went quiet, there was no official recognition. No vigil. No statements. The town moved through the date without ceremony, and that, too, meant something. The case no longer needed performance to validate its importance. It had already reshaped how people behaved. That night, the weather mirrored the past again, cold, still, metallic. A few residents noticed. Most did not. The roads were empty for reasons unrelated to fear. The absence of panic felt like a measure of distance traveled. Some were in storage, the boxes remained, meticulously labeled, their contents unchanged. Evidence does not age. Only interpretation does. The lesson held steady. The Ohio 1987 cold case had taught an entire system how to slow down, how to distrust its own confidence, how to wait without giving up. As another year folded into the next, the case no longer asked to be solved. It asked to be remembered correctly. Not as a miracle of technology or a triumph of persistence alone, but as a long negotiation with time, marked by missteps, endurance, and the refusal to let silence win by default. The story, still unfinished in its own way, lingered at the edges of daily life, a quiet companion rather than a specter, reminding anyone who listened closely that the past never stops speaking, it only changes how it chooses to be heard. The final shape of the Ohio 1987 cold case did not arrive with a bang, a revelation shouted into microphones, or a photograph splashed across front pages. It arrived the way most truths do when they are late, quietly, almost apologetically, settling into place after everyone has learned how to live without it. By the time history closed its fingers around the case, there was no illusion left that justice could rewind time. What remained was something thinner, heavier, harder to define. In the years that followed, the case stopped being an event and became a reference point. Detectives spoke its name the way sailors speak of storms they never saw but were trained to respect. Prosecutors cited it when younger attorneys pushed too hard for clean narratives. Evidence technicians mentioned it in passing while teaching interns how to log, seal, and store, their voices lowering slightly, as if the case could still hear them. The town carried on, but the past never fully released its grip. Certain houses were never sold easily. Certain stretches of road resisted development. There were places where people still slowed down without knowing why, where conversations dipped for no logical reason. Memory, like evidence, does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just alters behavior. The victim's name appeared less often now, but when it did, it carried a different weight. No longer shorthand for mystery or fear, it had become something closer to warning. A reminder that ordinary nights can fracture without sound, that safety is often assumed until it is revoked. Teachers mentioned the case in ethics classes. Journalists used it to illustrate restraint, what happens when speculation outruns proof, when pressure bends process. Inside the department, the file was officially closed, but unofficially, it never would be. There were no illusions about finality. Too many questions remained unanswered, not because they were hidden, but because time had eroded the mouths that could speak them. Witnesses were gone. Memories had thinned to impressions. Motives, once sharp, had dulled beyond recognition. The truth, whatever version of it existed, had survived, but incomplete. And yet, there was something undeniable in the closing of the case, something that resisted cynicism. It proved that silence was not the same as erasure. That even decades later, the past could be confronted, if not fully understood. Forgotten evidence had changed everything, not by revealing a perfect answer, but by forcing a reckoning with how easily answers can be missed. On certain nights, long after the headlines stopped, a few people still found themselves awake, replaying details they could never quite release. A taillight reflection. A door left unlocked. A phone that never rang. These fragments floated through the town like static, faint but persistent. Not haunting. Just present. The Ohio 1987 cold case did not end. It settled. Into policies. Into habits. Into the collective instinct to pause before assuming, to double-check before dismissing, to listen longer than feels necessary. Its legacy was not closure, but calibration. And somewhere between what was proven and what was lost, the case left behind its final truth, spoken not in verdicts or files, but in the space it carved into memory, that time does not bury the past, it only waits to see if anyone is willing to dig carefully enough to face what's still there. There was, however, one more way the Ohio 1987 cold case continued to breathe, long after officials stopped speaking its name out loud. It lived in the pauses. In the extra seconds before a decision was made. In the hesitation that crept into conversations where certainty once rushed and unchecked. The case had trained an entire generation to respect the gap between what is known and what is merely assumed. For those who worked it late in their careers, retirement did not mean release. Former detectives carried the case with them into quieter lives, into mornings that no longer began with radios crackling to life. They noticed how often their thoughts returned to that winter, to the evidence that had waited so patiently to be understood. Some framed the original newspaper clippings, not as trophies, but as reminders of humility. Others kept nothing at all, trusting memory to do the work. The files themselves remained motionless, but the meaning attached to them continued to shift. What once looked like negligence was now studied as limitation. What once felt like failure was re-examined as the cost of working without the tools the future would provide. The case became less about blame and more about anatomy, how an investigation is built, where it fractures under pressure, how easily momentum can turn into tunnel vision. In classrooms and training rooms, instructors no longer dramatized the case. They stripped it down. Dates. Timelines. Gaps. They asked students not what they would have done differently, but what they would have noticed sooner. The exercise was never comfortable. It wasn't meant to be. Comfort had been the enemy in 1987. The town's relationship with the case grew quieter still. There were no more anniversary stories, no more whispered theories traded across counters. Yet the awareness lingered, embedded in the collective reflex. People locked doors more carefully. They noticed unfamiliar cars sooner. They trusted instincts they once would have laughed off. The case had not made them afraid. It had made them attentive. The family, now years removed from the courtroom, learned to exist without the gravity of constant expectation. They were no longer waiting for justice to arrive. It already had, in its incomplete, imperfect form. What they waited for now was something softer, the chance to live without measuring every moment against what had been taken. Some days, they succeeded. Other days, the past pressed in without warning. Healing, they understood, was not a destination. It was maintenance. There were still rumors, of course. There always are. Someone claimed to know something once. Someone else insisted the truth was larger than what had been proven. These stories circulated briefly, then faded, unable to attach themselves to evidence. The case had taught the community a rare discipline: not every story deserved oxygen. At night, when the town was quiet and the roads lay empty, the geography of the case remained unchanged. The same bends in the road. The same stretch of darkness where headlights once cut through cold air. Time had altered the scenery, but not the memory embedded in it. Places remember, even when people try not to. The Ohio 1987 cold case had begun as a rupture, sudden, violent, destabilizing. Over time, it became something else entirely. A calibration point. A caution etched into routine. It did not shout anymore. It didn't need to. Its influence was already everywhere, woven into how questions were asked, how silence was interpreted, how patience was practiced. And so the story continued, not as a headline or a mystery waiting to be reopened, but as an undercurrent. A reminder that some truths arrive late, some never arrive fully, and some exist only in the discipline they leave behind. The case had changed everything once. Now it simply remained, steady and unresolved in the only way that mattered, present, instructive, impossible to ignore for those who had learned how to listen. Long after the last official memo was written and the final evidence log was signed, the Ohio 1987 cold case continued to assert itself in subtler ways, like a low-frequency hum only noticeable when everything else goes quiet. It surfaced not as memory, but as instinct. A feeling that something small might matter more than it appears. A refusal to rush past details simply because they complicate the story. For journalists who had once chased the case, it became a reference they carried into other investigations. They remembered how early assumptions had hardened into headlines, how pressure had shaped tone as much as facts. In later years, when a source spoke too confidently or a narrative aligned too perfectly, they paused. The case had taught them that truth rarely arrives fully formed, and that certainty is often the most seductive distraction of all. The evidence itself, preserved and catalogued, seemed almost indifferent to the weight placed upon it. Fibers, photographs, transcripts, mute, unchanging, stripped of urgency. And yet those objects had outlasted careers, reputations, even lives. They had waited while people aged around them, while technologies evolved to finally understand what had been there all along. In that patience, there was something unsettling. Evidence does not forgive. It simply waits. Among retired officers, conversations occasionally drifted back to that winter. Not to debate guilt or innocence, but to examine moments. A decision made late at night. A lead set aside because it didn't fit. A witness dismissed too quickly. These weren't confessions. They were autopsies of process. Attempts to understand how easily momentum can masquerade as progress. The town itself no longer spoke of the case in the language of fear. Instead, it existed as a shared reference point, a quiet understanding that some nights change everything without warning. Parents passed down rules without explanation. Lock the door. Call when you arrive. Trust your gut. The lessons were inherited, not announced. There were those who still searched for meaning beyond the official record. They studied maps, timelines, weather reports, convinced that somewhere, something essential had been overlooked. But the longer the case lived, the clearer it became that its power no longer resided in answers. It lived in restraint. In the collective agreement to stop forcing resolution where none could be proven. The convicted man aged into obscurity, his story flattening into routine. Appeals exhausted themselves. Interviews dried up. Whatever version of the truth he carried, if he carried one at all, no longer mattered to the machinery around him. The case had moved past individuals. It had become structural. And yet, the absence at its center never fully disappeared. There were moments, unexpected and sharp, when the loss reasserted itself. A name spoken aloud. A photograph rediscovered. A voice remembered. Time had softened nothing. It had only changed how pain announced itself. The Ohio 1987 cold case had traveled a long arc, from rupture to obsession, from obsession to caution, from caution to legacy. It no longer demanded attention. It commanded respect. Not because it was solved, but because it resisted simplification. As years continued to stack quietly on top of one another, the case remained where it had always been, just beneath the surface of ordinary life, influencing decisions, shaping instincts, reminding anyone who paid attention that the past does not fade. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it rarely says what we expect, only what we need to hear to avoid making the same silence twice. With time, even legacy takes on a quieter tone. The Ohio 1987 cold case stopped being cited with emphasis and started being referenced in passing, folded into conversations that were no longer about it, but informed by it. Its presence was implicit, not declared. A shared understanding that hovered beneath professional judgment, like a background calibration no one bothered to name anymore. New cases came and went, each demanding urgency, each threatening to consume attention the way this one once had. But something was different now. Investigators were slower to crown suspects, slower to trust coincidences that felt too convenient. They remembered, even if they couldn't articulate why, how easily momentum had once overridden doubt. The case had taught them that speed can feel like control, even when it's not. In the town, memory thinned further, but it did not disappear. It shifted into landmarks rather than stories. A parking lot where nothing ever quite felt neutral. A stretch of road people avoided at night without knowing why. Places where the air seemed heavier, not with fear, but with recognition. Geography had absorbed what language no longer carried. The victim's life, so often overshadowed by the mechanics of her disappearance, began to re-emerge in private ways. Old friends spoke of her without lowering their voices. Family members told stories that had nothing to do with the case, small moments, ordinary laughter, details that had once felt inappropriate to share while the mystery consumed everything. This, too, was a kind of resolution. Not official. Not complete. But real. The evidence, still preserved, had become almost symbolic. It represented both failure and redemption, neglect and perseverance. Forgotten evidence had changed everything once, but it also stood as proof that the past is never inert. It waits. It accumulates meaning. It demands patience from those who dare to revisit it. For students of criminal justice, the case was no longer dramatic. It was granular. A sequence of choices examined without theatrics. What happens when a lead is deprioritized? When a witness is believed too quickly? When silence is interpreted as absence rather than resistance? The lessons were uncomfortable precisely because they were ordinary. At times, someone would ask whether the case could ever truly be considered finished. The question usually went unanswered. Not because the answer was complicated, but because it felt irrelevant. The case had already done its work. It had altered behavior, reshaped instincts, left its imprint on systems and people alike. Closure, in the traditional sense, seemed beside the point. As decades pressed forward, the cold case lost its sharp edges but gained a deeper gravity. It was no longer about what happened that night in 1987. It was about everything that followed, the choices made, the patience learned, the discipline earned through failure. It had become a long echo rather than a single sound. And in that echo lived the final, unspoken understanding, that some stories never end cleanly, not because they are unresolved, but because they continue to influence the present. The Ohio 1987 cold case did not fade into history. It embedded itself into the fabric of how truth is pursued, how silence is questioned, and how time, no matter how much passes, never fully closes the door it once opened. Even as the years stretched farther from that winter, the Ohio 1987 cold case retained a quiet authority, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. It had outlived outrage, outlived obsession, even outlived certainty. What remained was influence, subtle, persistent, impossible to trace to a single source, yet undeniably present in the way people approach the unknown. Those who encountered the case late, through archives or training manuals, often underestimated it at first. On paper, it looked contained. Dates aligned. Evidence cataloged. A conclusion reached. But the longer they sat with it, the more they sensed what couldn't be diagrammed. The hesitation between steps. The decisions made under pressure that no flowchart could justify or condemn. The case resisted simplification, and in doing so, it educated without instructing. In the town, the case had long since detached from daily conversation, but it lingered in ritual. Porch lights left on a little longer than necessary. Calls made to confirm safe arrivals. A tendency to notice when routines broke. These habits weren't born of fear anymore. They were born of memory that had matured into caution. The family, having carried the weight longer than anyone, learned that the passage of time does not lessen loss, it reorganizes it. Grief no longer dominated every thought, but it never vanished. It surfaced unexpectedly, triggered by seasons, by weather that echoed the past, by moments of joy that reminded them of what should have been shared. Still, they endured, not because the case had ended, but because life insisted on continuing. Professionally, the case became a benchmark against which patience was measured. When pressure mounted to close files quickly, someone would inevitably recall Ohio, 1987, not as a warning shouted aloud, but as a quiet recalibration. Slow down. Check again. Assume nothing. The words were rarely spoken, yet widely understood. There were nights when former investigators dreamed of the case without faces or facts, only sensation. Cold air. Dim light. The feeling of having missed something just out of reach. These dreams carried no answers, only reminders that some cases leave imprints not on records, but on the people who carry them. The story had long since moved beyond guilt or innocence. It had become a meditation on time itself, on how truth behaves when left alone long enough, on how evidence waits without impatience, on how human certainty erodes faster than facts ever do. Forgotten evidence had changed everything once, but what followed proved that revelation is not the same as repair. As the world accelerated around it, the Ohio 1987 cold case stood in quiet contrast. It asked nothing of the present except respect. Respect for process. For silence. For the idea that not knowing is sometimes more honest than forcing an answer. And so the case persisted, not as a mystery begging to be reopened, but as a presence, steady, instructive, unresolved in the only way that mattered. It reminded those willing to listen that the past is not a closed chapter. It is a margin note written in permanent ink, shaping how every future line is read, long after the page itself is turned. By the time the Ohio 1987 cold case reached what most people would call its final distance from the present, it no longer felt like a case at all. It felt like an atmosphere. Something you moved through rather than confronted. Its details had thinned, but its influence had thickened, settling into the spaces where decisions are made quietly, without ceremony. Those who inherited the systems shaped by it rarely knew its full chronology. They didn't need to. They felt it in the redundancies built into procedure, in the insistence on documenting what once would have been waved away. The case had rewritten priorities without rewriting rules. It had taught an entire generation that the most dangerous moment in an investigation is not chaos, but confidence. The town continued to change. New families arrived with no connection to the past, no reason to flinch at certain names or intersections. And yet, slowly, they absorbed the same behaviors. The way neighbors checked in on one another. The way silence was noticed instead of ignored. Culture, like memory, does not require explanation to propagate. It only needs repetition. For the family, the case had become something they carried without effort, like a limb long healed but never forgotten. They no longer measured time by anniversaries or court dates. They measured it by ordinary milestones, birthdays, graduations, quiet dinners that once would have felt impossible. The case had taken enough. They no longer allowed it to take the present. In professional circles, the cold case was rarely named, but its logic surfaced again and again. When a piece of evidence seemed insignificant, someone lingered a moment longer. When a theory fit too cleanly, someone disrupted it on principle. These habits did not feel dramatic. They felt responsible. The case had normalized doubt as a form of care. There were still moments when the unresolved aspects pressed forward, demanding attention. A new technology. A re-examination of old methods. A question raised too late to answer fully. Each time, the response was the same, not urgency, not dismissal, but patience. The case had taught that time is not an enemy if it is treated honestly. The Ohio 1987 cold case never offered a perfect ending. What it offered instead was endurance. Proof that truth can survive neglect, that evidence can outweigh assumption, that silence is not the absence of meaning. Forgotten evidence had changed everything once. What followed proved that change does not arrive all at once. It accumulates. As the years continued forward, unmarked and uncelebrated, the case remained where it belonged, not at the center of attention, but at the edge of awareness. A quiet reminder embedded in routine, shaping how people listened, how they waited, how they resisted the urge to conclude too soon. And in that persistence lay its final resonance. The Ohio 1987 cold case did not resolve the past. It disciplined the future. It left behind no clean answers, only a lasting instruction written into habit and restraint, that some truths demand time, some never arrive whole, and some matter not for what they explain, but for how they teach us to keep looking long after the noise has faded.